Good morning, History 102, and welcome. This week we're doing Chapter 23, in which we're going to talk about the Cold War and how it affected notions of American freedom. On September 16th of 1947, the 160th anniversary of the Constitution signing, the Freedom Train opened to the public in Philadelphia. This train contained dozens of the most significant historical documents in American history, including the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address. Visitors were asked to affirm American ideals by taking a freedom pledge and signing a freedom scroll. More than 3.5 million visited the train, and even more attended the educational programs and parades that accompanied it. Beneath the surface of the train's exhibits lay conflict over the meaning of American freedom. Archivists who proposed the initial list of documents for the train had intended to include the Wagner Act, which granted workers the right to organize unions, and President Roosevelt's Four Freedom speech, in which he articulated freedom from want. The Conservative American Heritage Foundation, to which the Truman administration had turned over the project, eliminated these documents from the exhibit. The foundation also would not include the 14th and 15th Amendments, which had established during Reconstruction equal civil and political rights regardless of race. The train also did not mention unions or social welfare, and only three documents, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, which had outlawed slavery, and a 1776 letter by South Carolina patriot Henry Lawrence, the same one that you saw in Hamilton, who fought alongside him, criticized slavery, spoke to Black Americans' history. The Freedom Train's journey also revealed the growing impact of how the Cold War affected America. Just before the train opened to the public, President Truman declared that the United States would adopt a policy of the containment of Soviet power across the world, and that disloyal Americans would be removed from government jobs. Government officials soon praised the train for contributing to the fight against communist subversion, and the FBI even reported on those who criticized the exhibit. The Freedom Train's history showed how the Cold War reshaped freedom's meaning by imbuing it with anti-communism, advocacy for free enterprise, and support for the status quo in American society. The Cold War led to widespread fears of a communist takeover in the United States, a task far beyond the capacity of the minuscule American Communist Party or the Soviet Union. This image is from the first page of This Godless Communism, an issue of a comic book series called Treasure Chest, published from 1946 to 1972. The issue warned of the danger that communists might overthrow the government and detailed the horrors of life in a communist America, including the arrest and jailing of priests and ministers. It was circulated to parochial schools by the Roman Catholic Church and contained an introduction by J. Edgar Hoover, then head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Today, we're going to be talking about the origins of the Cold War and how the Cold War influenced American ideas of freedom. We'll also discuss the Truman presidency and the anti-communist crusade, also known as McCarthyism. Our first focus question: what series of events and ideological conflicts prompted the Cold War? After World War II, the United States possessed enormous industrial capacity, the largest Navy and Air Force in the world. The Army was then demobilized. It also had the only atomic bomb in the world. This made it by far the most powerful military nation on Earth. Roosevelt had wanted to avoid a return to the isolationism of post-World War I America and believed that the United States should lead efforts to establish cooperation, democracy, and prosperity across the globe, in part through new institutions such as the World Bank and the United Nations. U.S. leaders believed that America's security depended on stability in Europe and Asia, and that American prosperity required the rebuilding of economies worldwide. The chief obstacle to American leaders' visions for the post-war world seemed to be the Soviet Union, whose victorious military occupied much of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. The Soviet Union's triumph over Germany and its claims that communism modernized Russia appealed to colonized peoples who desired national independence, And like the United States, the USSR intended to reshape the world in its own image. Though Americans knew that Soviet military was too weak to directly threaten the United States, they accurately recognized Soviet intentions to dominate Eastern Europe. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was formed only to defeat Hitler. Clashes between American and Soviet interests and values were bound to resurface after the war. The Cold War's first event occurred in the Middle East, where Soviet troops occupied parts of northern Iran with rich oil fields. Pressured by Britain and the United States, the Soviets withdrew troops from Iran but simultaneously installed pro-communist governments in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, a move that they compared to U.S. domination in Latin America. To many Americans, Stalin seemed to have violated his promise at Yalta for free elections in Poland. Shortly thereafter, U.S. diplomat George Kennan, in his famous long telegram, told the Truman administration that communist ideology made the Soviet government inherently and permanently aggressive. Only America, he wrote, could prevent the extension of Soviet communist rule in the world. This was the basis for the policy of containment, in which the United States aimed to check all Soviet attempts to expand its power in the world. In a speech in Missouri, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain had fallen over Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. I highly suggest that you search for Churchill Iron Curtain speech on YouTube. There are many excellent excerpts and recording of this speech, and it is phenomenal. This speech reinforced emerging beliefs that long-term struggle between the United States and the Soviets was at hand. In March of 1947, Truman announced a new policy, which came to be called the Truman Doctrine. The United States was now engaged in global conflict with the Soviet Union. When he became FDR's vice president in 1944, Truman was an obscure senator from Missouri with little foreign policy experience, and as the president, he soon faced daunting foreign policy challenges. He did not trust Stalin, and he believed that the United States had to assume world leadership. Truman decided to embrace containment when Britain signaled that it could no longer afford military aid to Greece, where the monarchy faced a communist-led revolt, and to Turkey, where the Soviets wanted joint control of the crucial straits linking the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Britain asked America to step in. Though unrest in Greece and Turkey was mostly homegrown and incited by corrupt and undemocratic governments, these states were strategically important as the doors to southern Europe and the oil-rich Middle East. To win Congress's support for containment, Truman was told to frighten the American populace, and he repeatedly invoked the nation's responsibility to defend freedom at home and abroad. Truman's rhetoric laid the framework for how Americans viewed the post-war world, and it became the guiding spirit of American foreign policy. Republican and Democratic support for Truman's policy initiated a long period of bipartisan backing for containment. And his speech showed the extent to which the Cold War was an ideological conflict in which both powers claimed that their social system was a model for other nations and that they advanced freedom and social justice while defending their own security. Congress's approval of military aid to Turkey and Greece rescued these governments and checked Soviet power. Truman's speech and policy committed the United States to a permanent responsibility in the world and set precedent for U.S. support of undemocratic anti-communist regimes for the creation of military alliances against the Soviets. The Truman administration soon established new national security agencies such as the National Security Council, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Central Intelligence Agency, which were removed from congressional oversight in 1947. Potential military action was only one element of containment. Secretary of State George C. Marshall outlined another in a speech in June 1947, in which he committed the United States to spending billions of dollars to finance Europe's economic reconstruction. The destruction caused by the war, food scarcity, and inflation plagued the continent, and these crises expanded support for communist parties in France and Italy, where American leaders feared might go communists. The Marshall Plan promoted the idea that capitalism, even after the Great Depression, would flourish. And it defined as threat to American security not just Soviet military power, but also economic and political instability that nourished communism. The Marshall Plan gave a positive meaning to containment, making freedom more than just anti communism. It represented a kind of New Deal for Europe that would establish mass industry and mass consumption in order to provide employment and a higher standard of living for Europeans. By 1950, production in Europe exceeded pre war levels, but the plan exacerbated tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which refused to support a plan that would consolidate U.S. influence in Europe. Along with 23 other nations, the United States simultaneously created the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, GATT, to foster more free trade and create larger markets for American goods and investments. In Japan, General Douglas MacArthur administered a U.S. occupation that ended in 1948 with a new democratic constitution and land reform. The new constitution gave women the vote and affirmed that Japan would never again wage war and would only maintain a small military force for self defense. The United States supervised Japan's economic recovery as well, though U.S. policymakers considered dissolving the giant industrial corporations that had enabled Japanese aggression. This idea was scrapped when it was determined that a strong Japanese economy would check communism in Asia. By the 1950s, Japan's economy was booming. This is an image from President Harry S. Truman's Truman Doctrine speech given before Congress March 12, 1947. And this is a page from a Dutch pamphlet promoting the Marshall Plan. Bales of American cotton in a warehouse at the French port of Le Havre in 1949. Part of the Marshall Plan aid program, the shipment helped to revive the French cotton textile industry. The Cold War rapidly intensified. At the end of World War II, each winning power occupied and administered parts of Germany and its capital, Berlin, which was located far inside the Soviet zone. In June 1948, when the United States, Britain, and France started a process which would lead to a new German government allied with them, the Soviets responded by blocking all traffic from the American, British, and French zones to the city. Western planes began an 11-month airlift of supplies to West Berlin. Stalin lifted the blockade, but the two nations, East and West Germany, took form, each allied with a different side in the Cold War. And Berlin stayed divided. West Berlin survived as an isolated city surrounded by communist East Germany, and only in 1991 was Germany reunified. In 1949, the Soviet Union also first tested an atomic bomb, thus ending the U.S. monopoly on nuclear arms. That year, the United States, Canada, and 10 nations in Western Europe created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. This was a mutual defense pact in the event of Soviet aggression in Europe. Many Europeans applauded when West Germany joined NATO because they hoped that it would prevent future German aggression and defend against Soviet advances. In turn, the Soviets in 1955 formed the Warsaw Pact, their own military alliance in Eastern Europe. Also in 1949, Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong won the Civil War in that country, thus dealing a heavy blow to the U.S. containment policy. The Truman administration, criticized by Republicans for having lost China to communism, did not recognize the new People's Republic of China and prevented it from taking its seat in the United Nations. Until the 1970s, the United States defended the exiled regime in Taiwan as China's legitimate government. In 1950, the National Security Council responded to the growing tension in Germany, China's new government, and the Soviet atomic bomb with a policy of permanent military armament. The document expressing this new policy, called NSC-68, depicted the Cold War as an epochal conflict between the identity and the idea of freedom and the slavery of the Soviets that would determine whether the free world survived. NSC-68 spurred monumental increases in military spending. Here we see children in Berlin celebrating the arrival of a plane bringing supplies to counter the Soviet blockade of the city in 1948. This was known as the Berlin Airlift. In the shadow of the Eiffel Tower in Paris of 1955, NATO delegates vote to admit West Germany to membership, symbolizing the political and military integration of Western Europe. And here we see a poster issued by the Defense Department's Office of Public Information in 1950, which sought to drum up popular support for the Korean War. An armed, determined Uncle Sam stands before an idealized rural landscape, an embodiment of all the things we have that needed to be defended by war, even though by this time most Americans lived in cities or suburbs. And here we see the division of Europe between communist and non-communist nations, which would last for nearly 40 years. The Cold War turned hot in Asia, not in Europe. In 1945, Korea was split into Soviet and American zones. These became two governments, a communist North Korea and an anti-communist and democratic South Korea, aligned with America. In June of 1950, North Korean troops invaded the South in an attempt to unify the peninsula under communist rule, and they nearly conquered all of South Korea. Truman interpreted the invasion as a Soviet challenge to the U.S. containment policy, and the UN authorized military action. American troops, led by General Douglas MacArthur, launched a campaign that resulted in the U.S. occupation of most of North Korea. But in October of 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed the border and pushed UN forces back down the peninsula. When MacArthur demanded the right to use nuclear weapons to repel the Chinese and perhaps even invade China, Truman declined. MacArthur's refusal to recognize the president's civilian control of the military led to his dismissal. The war reached a stalemate around the 38th parallel, and in 1953, an armistice left the two pre-war nations intact without any formal peace treaty. That intact 38th parallel line remains to this day a very strong point of discomfort between the North and the South. More than 33,000 Americans, 1 million Korean soldiers, 2 million civilians, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops died. The Cold War that began in Europe now became global in scope. Events since 1947 suggested that the war had not found peace, as had been hoped in 1945 when the UN was founded. Instead of one world living in harmony, the world was split between the United States, which then became known as the West, including Japan, or the free world or the communist sphere. The United States formed more military alliances in Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, and the Middle East, known as the CENTO, effectively surrounding the Soviet Union and China. Chinese communists carrying portraits of Mao Zedong, who took control of the country's government in 1949 after a long civil war. This map indicates where General Douglas MacArthur launched his surprise landing at Incheon, North Korea. Forces controlled nearly the entire Korean peninsula. A photograph of a street battle in Seoul, Korea during the Korean War illustrates the ferocity of the fighting. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's brutal regime jailed or murdered millions. Its authoritarianism made the Soviet Union seem antithetical to free enterprise and democracy. But some Americans argued that approaching the Cold War as a titanic struggle between freedom and slavery was problematic. Even George Kennan, who inspired the containment policy, argued that U.S. leaders should avoid ideological decisions and view the international crisis on a case-by-case basis to determine if freedom or American interests were actually in danger. Walter Lippmann, a prominent journalist, condemned turning foreign policy into an ideological crusade that required the United States to constantly intervene abroad and violate its own ideals by allying with authoritarian anti-communist governments, many of which faced rebellions sparked by domestic problems, not Soviet subversion. Lippmann argued that communists were bound to be part of the movements for national independence and that the United States should itself support. The war elevated awareness in the United States about imperialism and decolonization, even as anti colonial movements used the Declaration of Independence to make claims for American self government. Some liberals and black leaders pressed Truman to promote decolonization, and in 1946, the United States gave independence to the Philippines. But the Cold War saw the United States retreat from the pressure that FDR had exerted on Americans' European allies to grant sovereignty to the colonies. Britain and France hoped to retain their possessions in Africa and Asia. While geopolitical interests and economic interests influenced U.S. foreign policy as much as ideas of freedom, U.S. policymakers used the language of freedom to justify actions that seemed to contradict freedom. Even extremely repressive governments were included in the free world as long as they were anti-communist. One such ally was South Africa, where an apartheid regime preserved white supremacy and suppressed the black population. Our next focus question: how did the Cold War reshape ideas of American freedom? The Cold War was an ideological conflict in which both sides sought to win support across the world. Freedom was central to mobilizing public opinion, and in the 1950s it was a prominent theme in academia, the media, mass culture, and government. The Cold War set the boundaries for understanding freedom. Culture and history were mobilized for the Cold War. Historians argued that the American creed of pluralism, tolerance, and equality had always defined American life, and neglected the way in which race and ethnicity had restricted freedom. The federal government pressed Hollywood to make anti-communist films, from which all references to racism were to be removed under a program called Militant Liberty. The CIA and the Defense Department patronized the arts, enlisting actors, dancers, and musicians to promote the superiority of American values at home and abroad, and sponsoring magazines and academic conferences. The CIA even funded the controversial abstract expressionist art of painter Jackson Pollock, whose canvases, created by dropping and splashing paint, were said to embody cultural freedoms absent in socialist nations, and funded the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. This was controversial with some members of Congress who preferred Norman Rockwell's portrayal of a small town life. The State Department assembled a diverse exhibition of contemporary American artists, but abandoned the project and sold the works at auction. In 2013, they were exhibited at Indiana University with the overall title Art Interrupted. The Cold War's other master concept was totalitarianism, first used in World War II to describe fascist Italy and Germany as aggressive, ideological governments that harshly controlled all of civil society and denied the rights and alternative values that might lead to social change. The term soon came to be to describe the Soviet Union and its allies. This concept helped support and spread the belief that powerful governments were the greatest threats to freedom. Whatever the Soviet Union supported was automatically deemed antithetical to freedom. The American Medical Association launched the largest public relations campaign in history against Truman's proposal for national health insurance, calling it socialized medicine. This is a poster for The Red Menace, one of numerous anti-communist films produced by Hollywood in the 1950s. Visitors to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City contemplate a work by Jackson Pollock, whose paintings exemplified the artistic school of abstract expressionism promoted during the Cold War as a reflection on American freedom. The paintings had no recognizable subject other than reminding the viewer of how Pollock had created them by flinging paint at the canvas. "I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them," Pollock declared. Another painter whose work seemed to exemplify American artists' freedom from the constraints of European traditions was Mark Rothko. This painting has no subject other than the color itself, with different shades of red meant to evoke what Rothko called the basic human emotions: tragedy, ecstasy, and doom. The Cold War also helped shape the idea of human rights. World War II's atrocity and the Four Freedoms of the Atlantic Charter sparked calls for a new global order ruled by universal rights for all of humanity. The war crimes trials of German officials showed that the international community would hold individuals accountable for violations of human rights. In 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, which was drafted by a committee headed by Eleanor Roosevelt. It declared that all people should have basic rights to freedom of speech and religion, should be free from arbitrary government, and should enjoy social and economic entitlements such as housing, education, health care, and an adequate standard of living. Though the document could not be enforced anywhere, its assertion that governments should be accountable for the way that for the way they treated their citizens became widely accepted. Debates over the Universal Declaration of Human Rights showed the contradictions and tensions in the idea of human rights, the degree to which human rights should supersede national sovereignty, and who or what should protect the human rights that governments violate are all still unsettled questions. Both the United States and the Soviet Union resisted the creation of a mechanism to enforce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because they feared outside interference in domestic and foreign policy. American leaders were particularly sensitive about race relations, which they feared might invite UN action against the United States. In the 1950s, Cold War considerations lifted human rights, and both America and the Soviet Union used human rights for their own interests. The USSR claimed to provide its citizens with social and economic rights, while the United States criticized the Soviets for violating democratic rights and civil liberties. Only in 1992 did Congress ratify the part of the Universal Declaration that covers civil and political rights. It has not yet ratified the Declaration's economic, social, and cultural rights. This is Human Rights. This cartoon from 1947 depicts delegates to a meeting of the UN Human Rights Commission as unruly schoolchildren. Eleanor Roosevelt lectures delegates from various countries about human rights. Now, children, she says, altogether, the rights of the individual are above the rights of the state. At the lower left, John Foster Dulles, an American delegate, aims a slingshot at the Soviet ambassador to the UN, Andrei Vyashinsky, who stands in the lower right corner wearing a dunce cap. Charles Malik of Lebanon offers the teacher an apple. Several delegates seem bored, others are attentive. Our next focus question: what major domestic policy initiatives did Truman undertake? After the war, Truman faced the monumental task of shifting America from war to peace. The more than 12 million men still in the military in 1945 wanted to return to their families and jobs, and demobilization occurred rapidly. While some veterans found civilian life difficult, others used GI Bill benefits to build or buy homes, start small businesses, and go to college. Most veterans went into the labor force, taking jobs from more than 2 million women workers. The government dismantled wartime agencies that regulated industry and labor and set price controls, which sparked immediate inflation. Backed by Democratic liberals and unions, Truman in 1945 tried to revive the New Deal politics with a program he eventually called the Fair Deal. This would improve the social safety net and raise living standards. Truman pressed Congress to hike the minimum wage, create a national health insurance system, and increase public housing, Social Security, and educational aid. The year 1946 was one of labor revolt. The AFL and CIO launched Operation Dixie to bring unions to the South and end the anti-labor conservatism of Southern politics, sending hundreds of labor organizations into the region's textile mills, steel factories, and fields. With no more overtime work for wartime production and skyrocketing inflation caused by the end of price controls, workers' real income dropped sharply. Workers, 5 million of them, responded by going on strike to demand wage raises. 750,000 steel workers conducted the largest strike in U.S. history up until that point. Even Hollywood studios shut down because of striking workers. One observer called it the closest attempt at a general strike in U.S. history. The strike wave alarmed President Truman, who became hostile to unions and won an injunction forcing coal miners back to work. In the 1946 elections, middle-class workers, scared by union unrest, voted Republican, and many workers angry at Truman's policies stayed home. The Democrats lost both houses of Congress, and Republicans for the first time since 1950. The Operation Dixie capitulated to the opposition of Southern employers and white workers' racism, keeping intact Southern political power in Washington. The 1946 election secured continuing domination of the Congress by a coalition of conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats. Republicans turned aside Truman's Fair Deal program and enacted tax cuts for wealthy Americans. Over a presidential veto, in 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act. This act sought to reverse some of the gains made by organized labor in the past decade. Among other things, it authorized states to pass right-to-work laws, prohibiting compulsory union membership. It also forced union officials to take anti-communist oaths. The act made it considerably more difficult to organize unions and over time contributed to the decline of organized labor's share of the national workforce. Here we see a few of the numerous World War II veterans who attended college after the war thanks to the GI Bill. In his first term, President Truman had embraced civil rights for African Americans, departing from the Roosevelt administration's relative lack of concern. The war against Nazism and its racial theories had raised Black militancy and consciousness about the plight of Black Americans. Many states established commissions on fair employment practices, and cities passed laws to end discrimination in jobs and public accommodations. A civil rights coalition of labor, religious, and Black groups supported these efforts. By 1952, the NAACP had raised the number of Black voters in the South to 20%, and in that year, no lynchings took place as many law enforcement agencies started to crack down on the practice. Sports started to desegregate after the Brooklyn Dodgers added Jackie Robinson to their team in 1947. Robinson had a history of civil rights activism and was tried and acquitted in 1944 when he refused to move to the back of a bus in Fort Hood, Texas. Robinson promised the Dodgers leadership that he would not respond to racist taunts. The tactic won Robinson nationwide respect, and his talent won him Rookie of the Year. His success opened the door to integration of baseball and led to the demise of the Negro Leagues. In 1947, a commission on civil rights appointed by Truman issued a report to secure these rights, calling on the federal government to end segregation and guarantee equal treatment in housing, employment, education, and criminal justice. The Truman administration, calling the report an American Charter on Human Freedom, hoped to deflect Cold War criticisms that American racial relations violated the democratic ideals of human rights. Truman soon presented to Congress a comprehensive civil rights program asking for a federal civil rights commission, anti-lynching and anti-poll tax laws, and laws for equal access in jobs and education, but Congress rejected it. In the summer of 1948, Truman desegregated the military, which became the first large integrated institution in American history. Truman went on to help construct the most progressive Democratic platform in history for the 1948 elections, which included a robust civil rights plank. This is an NAACP youth march. The civil rights movement was initially led not by the older generation, but by children. And here we see Jackie Robinson sliding into third base in 1949. This is part of a series of giant murals painted between 1941 and 1948 for the lobby of Rincon Center, formerly a post office, now a shopping mall in San Francisco. This work by artist Anton Reffiger links the four freedoms of World War II to a multicultural vision of American society. In Norman Rockwell's celebrated paintings shown in Chapter 22, all of the figures depicted are white. When the liberals at the 1948 Democratic Convention passed the Civil Rights Plan, many Southern delegates walked out immediately. These so-called Dixiecrats soon formed the State Rights Democratic Party and nominated for president Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina. If you don't know Strom Thurmond, you should really look him up. He's a very colorful character, and I don't mean multiracial. This part of the party's platform called for complete segregation of the races, and though he denied being racist, Thurmond argued that freedom of states to govern themselves was imperiled. Truman also faced a second political insurgency from the left. Left-wing critics of Truman's foreign policy formed the Progressive Party and nominated Henry Wallace for president. Wallace proposed expanding the welfare state and denounced segregation more vigorously than Truman. Wallace differed most strongly from Truman over the Cold War. He called for international controls on nuclear weapons and advocated trade with the Soviet Union. Yet, when Wallace welcomed the support of socialists and communists, opening the party to communist influence, liberals abandoned his candidacy. Though Wallace threatened Truman on the left and Thurmond threatened him from the Democratic South, Truman's primary challenger was the charismatic Republican candidate Thomas Dewey. Truman campaigned furiously, criticized the Congress for inaction, and recycled New Deal critiques of Wall Street and warnings that Republicans wanted to end Social Security. This election was the last before television transformed electoral politics by minimizing in-depth debate and presentations of ideology over policy. Despite a widely predicted Dewey victory, Truman won an overwhelming majority of the Electoral College. For the first time since 1868, blacks decisively influenced the outcome. Thurmond carried 4 Southern states, anticipating a later shift of these Democratic states' voters to the Republican Party. Wallace received fewer votes than Thurmond, an outcome that made criticism of Americans' foreign policy even less acceptable. This is the map of the 1948 presidential election. You can see Truman's landslide victory over Dewey, but the States' Rights Party in the South was rising to be an actual challenger. Our next focus question: what effects did the anti-communism of the Cold War have on American politics and culture? McCarthy. Let's get into that one, shall we? The Cold War completely transformed American life. Society was permanently militarized. The military-industrial complex forged by World War II persisted and expanded. The United States retained a large and active federal government, which spent billions on weapons and overseas bases. National security justified enormous government projects and expenditures, including aid to higher education and the building of a national highway system. It also made government officials secret and dishonest, leading, for example, to the covering up of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons testing conducted on U.S. soldiers and civilians. Cold War spending fostered economic growth and scientific and technological innovation that greatly shaped civilian life in medicine, computers, aircraft, and other products. Government research needs expanded higher education. The Cold War changed immigration policy to favor refugees from communist countries and increased pressure on American officials to minimize segregation. And the Cold War, like World War I, created a culture that was sharply differentiated from the loyal and disloyal, and eroded civil liberties. During the world between liberty and slavery automatically made those who could be linked to communism enemies of freedom. In 1947, Truman created a loyalty review system in which federal employees had to prove their devotion to America without knowing who was accusing them of disloyalty or on what basis. Along with persons suspected of disloyalty, this new system targeted homosexuals who worked for the federal government. Homosexuals were deemed particularly susceptible to Soviet blackmail, but ironically, the government conducted an anti-gay campaign at the same time that gay men enjoyed a powerful presence in the arts and were said to be expressions of American freedom. No espionage was revealed, but hundreds lost their jobs or resigned rather than be investigated. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, held hearings about communist influence in Hollywood. Celebrities and famous writers and directors were forced to appear before the committee or face punishment. Though some, like Ronald Reagan, alleged that the entertainment industry was rife with communism, others refused to testify, claiming that the HUAC violated constitutional protections for free speech and political association, which it did. A group called the Hollywood 10 went to jail for contempt of Congress, and Hollywood blacklisted them and hundreds of others who were accused of communist sympathies or who refused to identify alleged communists. Here we see North Las Vegas. Believe it or not, the Nevada test site used to detonate atomic bombs just 75 miles north of Las Vegas. People would gather on the strip to watch it, and do yourself a favor and Google some of the hairstyles associated with this movement. People would literally wear their hair as mushroom clouds. I wish I was kidding. And here we see movie stars led by Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall on their way to attend the 1947 hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee. This was a demonstration of support for those called to testify against alleged communist influence in Hollywood. In 1952, a quota was established allowing some Japanese immigrants to become American citizens. Here in the following year, hundreds take part in a naturalization ceremony in Seattle. And here we see a group of Mexican Americans who lacked work permits being taken from police headquarters in San Bernardino, California, for deportation to Mexico in 1954 during Operation Wetback. Here, an immigration official questions a farm worker in the fields near San Ysidro, California in 1954. Several high-profile legal cases exacerbated the anti-communist craze. Whittaker Chambers, a Time magazine editor, charged that in the 1930s, Alger Hiss, a State Department official, had given him secret documents to take to Soviet agents. Hiss denied the allegations, but was convicted of perjury and served 5 years in prison. Richard Nixon, a young Californian congressman and member of the HUAC, achieved national prominence because of his pursuit of Hiss. The Truman administration put Communist Party leaders on trial for advocating revolution, and several were imprisoned. In 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, working-class Jewish communists from New York, were convicted of conspiring to pass secrets about the atomic bomb to Soviets during World War II. The evidence against them was deemed too secret to be revealed at the time, but it later became clear that Julius had not given the secret of the bomb to the Soviets and that almost no evidence supported charges against Ethel. Even though their charges were less serious than spying or treason, the judge said they had helped to cause the Korean War, and thus they were sentenced to death and executed in 1953. Regardless of whether Hiss or the Rosenbergs were actually guilty, their trial strengthened American sense that a massive spy network in the United States endangered the nation. The climate of fear allowed an obscure Wisconsin senator to lead a spurious anti-communist crusade. In 1950, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, who was elected in 1946 because of a falsified war record, delivered a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he claimed to have a list of 205 communists employed at the State Department. The charge was baseless. He was constantly changing the numbers, and he never identified anyone who was actually disloyal. But McCarthy used his senatorial position to hold hearings and allege disloyalty at the Defense Department and other government agencies. Though many Republicans embraced McCarthy's campaign as a way to damage the Truman administration, his attack on government officials after Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952 alienated Republicans. Few politicians had the courage to speak up, but Maine's Margaret Chase Smith, the only woman in the Senate, condemned the campaign of hate and character assassination. In 1954, his allegations of disloyalty in the Army led to televised hearings that exposed McCarthy's tactics and led to his downfall. The Senate, with its Republican majority, claimed his action, and though McCarthy died 3 years later, McCarthyism continues to be used today to refer to abuse of power in the name of anti-communism, or in the name of anything in modern terms. Although anti-communism most affected the national government, it pervaded local government and life as well. States created committees based on the HUAC to ferret out alleged communists, and state and local authorities required loyalty oaths of teachers, pharmacists, and other professionals. Private groups like the American Legion and the National Association of Manufacturers also targeted individuals for their political beliefs. Organizations that had been influenced by communists in the 1930s and 1940s became tainted, and those who would not testify about their past and present political opinions or refused to name communists often lost their jobs. Un-American books, like Stories of Robin Hood, were removed from local libraries. Universities refused to host left-wing speakers and fired teachers who would not take loyalty oaths. The courts did nothing to halt these violations of civil liberties, and the Supreme Court defended the imprisonment of communists for their beliefs. Here we see demonstrations at a 1953 rally in Washington, D.C., demanding the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And this is Senator Joseph McCarthy at the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. McCarthy points to a map detailing charges about the alleged extent of the communist menace, while the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch, listens in disgust. And can we take a minute to just admire this guy with his head up going, oh my God, am I seriously hearing that? Because that's how most of McCarthy's allegations really were. It's awesome. Fire by cartoonist Herbert Bloch, also known as Herblock, offered this comment in 1949 on the danger to American freedom posed by the anti-communist crusade. Though Soviet spies were certainly in the United States, the minuscule Communist Party did not endanger American security. Most of those jailed or fired in the McCarthy era were guilty only of holding unpopular beliefs and engaging in lawful political activity. Anti-communism was a popular mass movement that had its uses. One basis was in ethnic groups with roots in Eastern European countries dominated by the Soviets, like the Polish, and among American Catholics who opposed communist hostility to religion. Government agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by J. Edgar Hoover, used anti-communism to increase their power. Anti-communism was also used for purely partisan political purposes. McCarthy and other anti-communist leaders seemed to criticize the legacy of Roosevelt and the New Deal more than they did Stalin and communism. Many Democrats embraced the anti-communism to deflect Republican allegations of disloyalty. The Democrats excluded many on the left and the Popular Front who had helped organize New Deal policies. Anti-communism made conformity the new definition of loyalty. Any criticism of the status quo now appeared subversive. Businesses used anti-communism against unions, white supremacists used it against black civil rights, and others used it to defend sexual morality and traditional gender roles against feminism and homosexuality. In the more modern terms, conservatives now often use allegations of communism and socialism to tar and feather liberals. Anti-communism, most persuasive from the 1940s to the 1960s, powerfully shaped American policies and culture. Republicans invoked communism to stymie Truman's political program. Truman became alarmed by excesses of anti-communism, and he seemed to retreat from it in policies and government. In 1950, he vetoed a measure that required subversive groups to register with the government, denied passports to their members, and authorized the president to deport or detain them. But sorry, I lost my place there for a moment. But Congress overrode his veto and enacted it. In 1952, a new immigration law, the McCarran-Walter Act, also passed over Truman's veto, which shot down Truman's proposals for immigration reform and allowed the deportation of communists, even if they were citizens. In 1954, the federal government's Operation Wetback resulted in the military deportation of about 1 million Mexican Americans alleged to be illegal aliens. Truman only barely expanded the coverage of Social Security, and instead of extending federal social welfare, private welfare prevailed. Union workers' contracts provided them with health insurance, wage increases that followed the cost of living, pensions, and paid vacations. But only workers in the unionized heavy industries enjoyed these benefits in America. In Europe, all workers received these benefits from the government. The non-unionized majority of the American population did not receive these benefits, a situation which created increasing inequality among laboring Americans. All political and social groups had to comply with anti-communism or be destroyed. And this severely damaged the labor and civil rights movements that had benefited from dedicated communist organizers. After the 1947 passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which withdrew bargaining rights and legal protections from union leaders who refused to swear they weren't communist, the CIO expelled left-wing unions with nearly 1 million members. Unions began to support Cold War U.S. foreign policies. Since left-wingers were more often the most militant advocates of women's rights and civil rights, their expulsion left unions unable to respond to the civil rights movement and an economy that shifted from manufacturing to service work. The civil rights movement changed. While major civil rights groups at first protested Truman's loyalty programs and criticized anti-communists for not defining racism as un-American, nearly all Black leaders and civil rights organizations were pressured into joining the anti-communist crusade. Groups like the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, that had united communists and non-communists in a struggle for both racial equality and social justice, disintegrated, leaving only legalistic groups like the NAACP. Black organizations adopted Cold War language to argue that segregation and racism in the United States gave credence to social criticisms of America, thus helping solidify Cold War understandings of freedom. In this climate of anti-communism and McCarthyism, criticisms of American policy, domestic or foreign, invited a harsh response. Truman's civil rights program faltered, but the booming economy of the 1950s, which produced an affluent society in America for the first time, produced a widening gap between white affluence and Black poverty and disenfranchisement that would help inspire the civil rights resurgence in the 1960s. Here, Blacks, led by A. Philip Randolph, are picketing at the 1948 Democratic National Convention. The delegates' adoption of a strong civil rights plank led representatives of several Southern states to withdraw and nominate their own candidate for president, Strom Thurmond. I hope you've enjoyed this week's lecture. Here are the focus questions that we considered. Next week, we're going to be talking about America as an affluent society in the 1950s, the golden age of Donna Reed and Lucy Ball. We'll also be talking about the Eisenhower era, the freedom movement, and finally the election of 1960. As always, I really hope you've enjoyed this. Please feel free to send any feedback you have. I look forward to hearing from you.